Hey everyone, welcome back to the Carrot Poker School. This is Grade 1, Lecture 4, and today's topic is going to be polarization. But not just that, we're also going to be discussing how relative hand strength changes based on polarization, and touching on something really important in poker, which is that your relative hand strength is actually sensitive to loads of different factors and is liable to be completely different in one spot to another based on things like board texture, the action sequence, the positional configuration, and more. So let's start off by understanding what relative hand strength really is. We've already seen in the Carrot Poker School Grade 1 how important it is to be able to estimate your equity. Not exactly, but being able to prescribe a rough ballpark figure for your equity, because this helps you choosing between lines like betting and checking, value betting, bluffing. All of these primary reasons for betting carry with them a minimum and maximum equity requirement for each bet size when you're value betting, or for whether you should be bluffing or just checking. So we've seen this already. So now that we understand these primary reasons for betting a bit more, it makes sense to try to become better judges of our hand's worth in any given spot to see if it qualifies for further investment. So that's what we're going to do to start with today. The first real obstacle to get around here when we're dealing with the true worth of our hand is to reject absolute hand strength. That might mean saying no to labels like one pair, top pair, flush. Clearly, it's more from a beginner when you hear a thought process such as, but I had a flush, I had to call. Because a flush can be the nut flush with 2 whole cards combining with 3 board cards, or it could just be having a 6 in your hand and there are 4 diamonds out there. Clearly, these two situations are not really comparable. What we want to do instead is engage with the following factors, which are going to determine the true worth of our hand. What we'll be calling our relative hand strength, our hand strength relative to all of the factors, the recognition of which separates good poker players from bad ones. So the first factor is range filtering. How have ranges changed in order to reach this spot? Ranges first filter right back at the beginning of the hand, pre-flop, when the hijack, for example, decides to open the pot. Instead of folding, that player is filtering their range away from certain hands and towards other hands. Filtering happens in a concentration sort of way. The concentration of some hands increases and others decreases. This can be very crude, as in pre-flop, where we just simply don't open certain hands and do open others. Or it could be a little bit more gradable, could happen on more of a spectrum. For example, if we're on the flop and we c-bet, we might just have certain hands at a lower frequency now and certain other hands at a higher frequency. So range filtering can be gradual or it can be really extreme. Texture. What has happened to the board? How's it run out? What has that done to upgrade or downgrade the strength of your hand? And finally, configuration. What was the initial starting point? Was it hijack versus big blind? Was it small blind against button 3-bet pot? These things have a massive effect on relative hand strength as the hand progresses. I'd say the most important one of these 3 is range filtering. All too often, students fail to ask themselves, how did I get here? How did I land on that spot? What were the action sequences that led to my opponent and I arriving on this river decision point? And what does that mean for our ranges respectively? These factors can drastically affect the means and the quantity of the investment your hand wants to make. The means of investment meaning, do you want to invest money passively by checking and calling? Or do you want to invest money aggressively by betting? Do you want to invest money at all? Maybe you don't. So relative hand strength is one of the core building blocks of being able to navigate your way around a poker hand, and how good you get at this skill is one of the absolute pinnacles, one of the true holy grails that you need to master to become a very strong poker player. When you look at some of the best players in the world, they will have a very innate and accurate sense of their relative hand strength, of how good their hand is, not just relative to their opponent, but relative to all of these factors that can separate top pair from top pair, flush from flush, even king high flush from king high flush, right? Depending on how we got to the spot, the texture, and the original configuration. So there are 2 main types of range filtering. That's to say 2 ways in which ranges can reduce the number of combos that they have in certain directions. So range filtering, to start with, is simply the amount of contraction that's taken place in a range. When a range contracts, it basically sheds some of its combos, and it can do so in 2 different ways. It doesn't just lose its combos randomly. It's not like when your range tightens and becomes less combos because you open in the hijack. It's not as if you fold half of the combos of aces and open half of the combos of 8-4 offsuit. You filter your range in a linear way pre-flop, where you're opening from the top down because you only have one way of entering the pot. If you were actually entering the pot by limping as well, you might actually have a more polarized raising range and have a limping range that had component parts in the middle of some of the hands that you would be raising, of some of those polarized hands. So it's quite interesting, right, that even the most basic events in poker, even the most bog standard decision points pre-flop, can actually show you that ranges are filtering right from the get-go. Polarizing is what happens when a range contracts by removing some of its more middling hands. So in other words, if a range sheds some combos, and the majority of the combos that are being shed, the combos that are being got rid of in this line, are mostly medium strength stuff, then the range will therefore be skewed towards the extremities a little bit more. This happens when a range takes a more aggressive action than it could have, i.e. betting instead of checking, or raising instead of calling or folding. We're not going to think about calling as an aggressive action. While calling is putting money into the pot, it's not aggressing, and calling certainly doesn't polarize a range. It has quite the opposite effect. A couple of things just to be aware of about the word polarizing. One, this word is a gradable adjective, which means that it's true on a spectrum. A range can polarize a little bit by getting rid of a few medium strength combos, or a few more medium strength combos, and it gets rid of good or bad hands. Or a range can highly polarize by overbetting and getting rid of every single medium strength hand, indicating that the range is now only going to consist of really strong value hands and then bluffs. So polarizing is very much a word such as bright or beautiful. It's true to an extent, and it's not a yes or no, black or white thing. One of the biggest pitfalls in a student's poker semantic understanding of vocabulary occurs when the student actually says polar means he's either got the nuts or nothing, and they take an extremely hardline view of the word polar, skewing the entire game tree to a meaninglessly extreme kind of verdict on what this word means. And that skews the understanding of the hand in the game tree in a really extreme way. Condensing is the opposite of polarizing. So a range, again, it's a way of contracting. A range contracts by condensing when it removes some of its strongest and weakest hands by taking a more passive action than it could have. This doesn't mean that every strong and every weak hand is removed, that the opponent only has a medium strength hand. It just means that the medium strength hands now exist at a higher density or concentration within the range than the really strong or really weak hands do, relative to what was the case before this more passive action than it could have taken was selected. So polarizing occurs when this starting range, this is an example of just a range before any betting has taken place, before any filtering. As you can see, it's landed on the flop with all sorts of hands at roughly equal concentrations, low equity hands, medium equity hands, and high equity hands. Before we've done anything, this is what the range looks like. Then when we take a more aggressive action than we could have by betting the flop, let's say, or raising our opponent's flop c-bet instead of calling or folding, what happens is that our range polarizes. The extent to which this happens is completely definable by the texture, in theory, the sizing that we use, and the configuration. So it's not that every time a range polarizes, it polarizes to just this extent, where we have a little bit of medium hands, some high equity hands, and some low equity hands. Not at all. Actually, what happens here is that the extent of polarization will vary depending on all of those factors. But if we were to say c-bet the flop, this is a pretty typical example of how the polarization would look. If, on the other hand, we were taking a more aggressive or bigger investment line, such as raising a flop c-bet to 80% pot, or something like that, then we would actually witness a more extreme polarization than this. We wouldn't see really any medium hands at all. We would see just some very good hands and some bluffs, and the bluffs can be varying equities. Actually, when we think about a medium equity hand that raises on the flop, we might actually be raising with some kind of draw that counts as a medium equity hand. So even in the case where we're raising a flop c-bet or overbetting the turn or doing something that looks really polarizing, we can still have some medium equity hands as long as they're in the form of nut potential showdown valueless draw hands and not in the form of sort of dead medium pairs or something like that. So there are medium equity hands in a polarized range, but they're the semi-bluff sort of contingent. When we're condensing, on the other hand, what we're doing is actually moving towards the middle, moving away from the extremities to some extent. Again, a check will be more condensing than another check depending on factors like position, stack size, relative configuration, pre-flop, all of these sorts of things. But by and large, condensing will have the following effect, where the range will have moved towards the middle. This is a very extreme condensing effect you see on your screen here. This would be an example of, say, maybe an in-position player checking back on a flop where they could have c-bet freely, and they're going to move dramatically towards the middle. This is not quite apt, this figure, because the red hands here, it's not the case that we will move towards only the highest equity, low equity hands. We will actually have a smattering of all low equity hands in there. We'll have some gut shots, we'll have some totally dead hands. There won't be an extreme cutoff point like this where we just have only the best low equity hands. But this is just a rough description of what's going on. When it comes to condensing, we may also not be fully capped like this. What you're looking at here is a depiction of an extremely capped range, right? Like a range that doesn't actually have any combos of the highest equity hands at all. This wouldn't be the case out of position. We do have to be more careful when we're protecting an out of position checking range. We can do more slow playing because, as we saw previously, our urgency is not so high, so we can actually delay our value betting a bit more from out of position. And this sort of very capped looking range would not exist in, say, the small blind when we check in a 3-bet pot as a pre-flop raiser, or even like a small blind opener, and especially not as like a pre-flop caller who's just checking all of their range, right? So this would be someone who's probably in position and actually is supposed to be playing a condensed and capped checking behind range in this spot. So relative hand strength against polarization. What happens? Let's put these two things together now. What do you think happens to our relative hand strength as our opponent becomes more polarized? Well, when your opponent is polarized to a significant extent, remembering that they can polarize a little bit or a lot, a few things are going to happen to our hand. So firstly, it's going to become harder to value bet thinly, and you may need to check some quite good looking hands, since villain has removed the more middling hands which could normally call and lose. One thought experiment I like to give my private students in situations like this is to think about the toy game named Ace King Queen game. In Ace King Queen game, there are only 3 cards in the deck, an ace, a king, or a queen. There are no flops, turns, or rivers community cards. You just get dealt one of them, and so does your opponent. When you get dealt the king, your opponent's range is the ace or the queen. So your opponent has an extremely polarized range when you have the king. And then would you want to value bet into the range that is either the ace or the queen? Presumably not, right? Because the queen is always going to fold, being the nut low. That can never win, it cannot even chop. It's basically guaranteed to lose if it calls because there only are 3 cards in the deck. And the ace is just going to call or going to raise and going to beat you. So it doesn't actually make any sense here to value bet with the king because you're either going to get raised as a value bet or a bluff, or you're going to get a fold from a queen. That's a very stark example where your opponent's range is incredibly polarized compared to your hand, and in that case it's not correct to do any aggressing, any betting whatsoever. And you need to take this with a pinch of salt because in the real world there are still hands we can bet against polarized ranges, but the idea is that the more polar your opponent's ranges become, the more you should be declining betting opportunities, checking to them, letting them do the betting, maybe betting smaller if you are betting, because they're going to do a lot of raising anyway, and just feeling less urgency to pile money into the pot yourself. The polarized range is always going to be betting at a higher frequency for the most part than a depolarized range, so it's usually correct for a range that's less polarized to check to let the polar range do the aggressing. You'll also want to defend passively to aggression, so when you face aggression from a polar range, by and large you will want to be calling mostly rather than raising. There will still be opportunities to what we call repolarize, that's to raise a polarized turn bet or something of that nature. And this is fine with a very selective range of high equity bluffs that are well selected, because you just need to have strict requirements in that spot in unfavorable worlds where you face big bets, and also value hands, of course. But basically in these situations, villain has begun contracting more heavily by betting big or betting a second or third time, whatever it may be, whatever the polarizing action, that player is moving towards 2 types of hands, either ones that will not be able to call a raise by you. Aggressing against your opponent's air is not the way to maximize EV when you have a good hand against air, right? Or secondly, maybe moving towards hands that are so strong that, yeah, they would continue if you raise them. So it'd be incomplete to say, oh, my opponent's got lots of really good hands here, so I'm going to raise the nuts. Actually, if you're in position and there's only 1 bet left or something, your opponent's going to shove the river very often anyway with those hands, so there's absolutely no reason for you to raise the turn necessarily. unless there's other things going on, like denying a lot of equity to other parts of his range or something. But generally, if you are ahead, then these really strong hands are likely to keep investing later anyway if you just call, and so too will some of the bluffs. The bluffs, meanwhile, will not be inclined to invest against a raise by you. So against polarized strategies, you want to decrease your raise frequency and generally just react by calling. Here's the first example where we want to avoid a thin looking value bet against a more polarized range. When I call this range polarized, I want you to take it with a pinch of salt, because let's trace the action sequence here. So in a 3-bet pot, small blind against button, button's hand is the ace-jack of diamonds. On 10-9 forward two-tone, small blind goes ahead and bets 60% pot, a very apt sizing for this texture, as we'll see in a future lecture. Then goes ahead and barrels the turn for 60% pot, keeping the sizing relatively smooth, which isn't something you have to do, but people are familiar with this, so fair enough setting up a kind of 70% pot river shove, I would think, in this situation, provided that both players started with 100 big blinds. And then instead of jamming the river, an action that small blind will very often take on this run out, small blind elects to check. The problem with shoving the ace-jack here in button shoes, you've just rivered the top pair, having been calling down with a non-made hand before, is that although your hand is winning really often and has a ton of equity, you're going to win the vast majority of the time here when you check. The issue is that villain's range mostly consists of slow plays, hands that beat you. Note that villain cannot have a hand like ace-5 of diamonds because you have that card. So they consist of like some slow plays like pocket aces that block your calling range, or pocket kings or ace-king, or something like that occasionally, although these hands are admittedly meant to shove very often, especially where they do a better job of unblocking the button's calling range. And then secondly, small blind is going to show up with some hands that are just airballs. They're giving up. They were bluffing previously, they're no longer bluffing, they're folding. So basically in this spot, the ace-jack, while it's really, really good and it's actually winning a ton, it can't go ahead and value bet in GTO terms, even though there's only a 40%. Sorry, my math was off there because the flop was B60, not B33. I'm more used to 33-60 shove. But yeah, after 60-60 shove, there's only a B40 actually remaining here after the larger 11 or 12 BB 3-bet preflop. So you can't even jam the last 40 big blinds in GTO with this hand because of the former polarization of your opponent's range and just the lack of mediocre bluff catchers that this hand would beat. If you think about it, villain just doesn't have a lot of hands wanting to check call here in this situation. They have mostly give-ups and then a few traps. Yes, there is some amount of king-queen or something that's meant to bluff catch in equilibrium here. In reality, I think that this value bet would be really bad, because I think actually people are not check calling and bluff catching this river as wide as you would see happen in game theory. So I think exploitatively, this is an even worse value bet than it looks to be theoretically. But the point stands, we want to avoid, by and large, thin value betting against more polarized ranges. Example 2 is about continuing passively against the polarized range, especially where your urgency to build the pot is lower. And in this spot, another 3-bet pot, small blind versus button. This time button has ace-jack and has 2-pair, calls the flop, range bet, R33 signals that small blind has elected to bet all of his or her range on this node on the flop. Button is called, and we head on to the 8 of clubs turn. Small blind then barrels for 60% pot, and the button has a decision with the ace-jack. Raising here is actually a huge blunder. It's a very bad thing to do. You can see that the EV of raise here actually throws away 10% of this pot. By calling here, we're entitled to 177% pot, which is huge, obviously. How can we be entitled to more than the pot? Well, because we have implied odds, we're actually, on average, guaranteed to win a bunch more money. Not every time, but by and large we will. And therefore our EV is more than the pot. If we call, our EV is still more than the pot, of course, but we squander some of that precious EV by needlessly raising. Imagine the two main types of hand that your opponent in the small blind will have in this spot. They will have a value range, which will be stuff like ace-queen or better. They will have a bluffing range, which will be stuff like king-queen, king-10, queen-10, 4-5, maybe just some hand like 10-9 or something like that sometimes. When they have the bluffing range and you jam, they will simply fold. Yes, you'll be getting them off of a gutter, but that's it. They're drawing dead to a gutter here. The most EV they can really have against you in this spot is a couple of outs to trips, or to a set, or 4 outs to a straight draw against this hand. It's simply not worth getting that fold equity and shutting down all of their river bluffs. The more polarized your opponent's ranges become, the more you can lump their hand strength into either something that you can get money from anyway by slow playing, because it's so strong it will value bet again or check call the next street, or alternatively a hand that you must actually slow play against in order to make any more money, i.e. air. So it's very important not to raise in this spot. Urgency is about as low as it can ever be, and it would be an extremely egregious mistake here to go ahead and just jam the ace-jack, citing some half-baked reasons such as I want to target ace-king or I want to deny equity to a straight draw. If you do those things, you're focusing on way too small a part of the game tree and you're not even looking at it in a comparative way. Remember that choices are decisions. That's the thing we're trying to drum into you in this course, is that every choice between betting and checking is a decision, and when you're making a decision you have to actually look at both the things you're deciding between. Just as when you go to a restaurant, you look at the menu, you don't just look at one thing on the menu and say, I'll have that. Well, maybe you do if you're really in the mood for it, but generally speaking, it's correct to compare all of your options before choosing a path. Same in poker. What about against condensing now? So if your opponent begins condensing their range, they're moving again towards the middle, and our approach against condensed range will change dramatically. Think of it this way, there has to be a certain amount of betting that goes on in a hand of poker. The more of that comes from you, the less of it comes from your opponent, and vice versa. The player with the less condensed, i.e. more polar range, the onus is really on them to do more of the betting. So when your opponent's condensed, you can assume that they're going to be more prone to investing money passively, and therefore to make money when you have a good hand, you have to fast play. Your value hands are really the things that drive your strategy. The bluffs in your range are more so there just as passengers. In some spots, bluffs are gaining tons of EV and they have to bluff, as we saw in the last lecture, but very often bluffs are just there to ensure that your value hands get paid, your bluffs break even, your value hands profit. That's the way it goes. So essentially, to cut a long story short here, when you have a range that's very polar compared with your opponent's range, it's you that has to do a lot of the investing because your value hands crave putting money in the pot now, knowing that your opponent's condensed range is less likely to do so if you check to them or slow play. So fast play your hand more when your opponent's range is condensed, slow play more when your opponent's range is polar. So you should use a larger sizing and seek value more aggressively. Sizing is key as well when villain is capped. Condensed ranges are by and large capped. It depends to the extent to which they're condensing, but a fully condensed range has moved fully towards the middle, away from all of the good hands, and is therefore a capped range. There isn't a downside to large value betting if we have a sufficient amount of landing equity, since we cannot isolate ourselves against too strong of a continuing range. This is actually impossible. You can't end up with too little equity after making a bet size if you have the immortal nuts. So when your opponent's range is capped, it's very often the case that you have a value region that can just go as big as it wants. Within reason, right? We don't need to put in more money than is in the stack. That's impossible. But we might want to facilitate pot growth such that we can get all of a stack in by the river, or just a lot of chips. So you should avoid slow playing for the most part when villain is very condensed, because villain is skewed towards the middle of his range, and such hands do most of their investing by calling, don't they, not betting. If you imagine your opponent having a hand like second pair, and I asked you what's the best way of getting money from second pair, should you bet or should you check? Well, trying to trap someone when they have second pair and you have top pair doesn't really make any sense, because second pair can only make very minimal betting investments. Maybe it can like block bet on the river for 33% pot or something, or 25% pot, but it's very unlikely to just start bombing. If you're against an opponent who starts bombing with second pair, then you're against a very bad poker player, and that's just a world of its own. But generally speaking, even weak poker players understand that potting it with second pair in the river is a terrible idea. If you're against somebody who thinks that that's a good idea as a double barrel or triple barrel or something, then you're just going to win lots of money in that game anyway, right? And it's just going to be such an extreme example that it perhaps no longer matters what you do. But generally speaking, you want to slow play against more polar ranges, fast play against condensed ones. So example 1, large value betting against a condensed range. This is a very common GTO spot where we would actually want to overbet. Our opponent check calls the flop and then checks the turn to us on ace 10 3 7, and you can see here that ace queen is going for an overbet very often. Yes, there's some noise here, there's some smaller bets being chosen by the solver as well. The sizing is at the top there, and then you have the frequency that it's taken at the bottom of that horizontal bar that I've just brought onto the screen. So ace queen there, you can see that that hand in particular is usually going for the overbet, and the horizontal bar actually describes what happens with our range. So our range is usually either going for an overbet or a check. And the reason for that is that the value hands that are within our range, that are the drivers of the strategy, the ones that are basically dictating how much money should be going into the middle, these hands crave a large investment ceiling by the river. They want loads of money going into the pot, and so they begin by pot building aggressively from this juncture forward to make sure that enough investment goes in. So classic overbet spots on the turn typically happen when you have a very strong value region due to your opponent's range being very condensed, so condensed that it's totally capped. When you have an uncapped value region that has unlimited pot growth expectation that wants loads and loads of money in by the end of the hand, and your opponent has an extremely condensed capped range that can't really harm you, that's when you want to be building a gigantic sizing and shoveling way more money than is currently in the pot into the pot to facilitate that very high investment level that the hand craves. Value hands dictate the strategy. There's nothing in this spot that actually tells your bluffs to go really big. It's actually a fallacy that a bluff is making way more money here against a capped range by going bigger than it is by going smaller. Generally speaking, bluffs in this spot don't actually care what sizing they use within reason. Okay, they don't want to bet 20% pot in position, but whether you bet pot or 2x pot here with a bluff doesn't really matter, but the eventual amount of money you put in with a value hand does matter, and so it's the value hand that drives the strategy. Example 2 is fast playing strong hands against condensed ranges again. This time we get cold called by a button player. We c-bet king, king, jack. We wouldn't actually be betting very many of the flops that are available here in this configuration because the button has such a condensed and pocket pair rich range. So if we're on a board like 9-7-5, we really wouldn't be doing any betting whatsoever as under the gun here in GTO. But we will be betting stuff on king, king, jack. We'll be betting a lot of stuff because the king and the jack are just two of the best cards for our range imaginable. And so then we barrel the turn, which is fine. You could also slow play the turn here at some frequency. Because you're out of position, it's correct to do that sometimes. This time we bet, and we end up with a triple barrel opportunity, and this time it's definitely correct to bet here. Checking here does constitute a mistake and an EV loss. As you can see, we lose 3% or so of what's actually a very big pot. So it's like 1% of what's a very big pot by checking. And we don't want to throw away 1% of a large pot. So this hand is a mandatory bet. If we were in position and the button was the big blind instead and wouldn't have the chance to bet the river, this would be a much bigger mistake not to value bet. But the point is, you can value bet much more aggressively, more thinly, and for bigger sizes against a more condensed range. You might be wondering, why do we not overbet the turn here? Is this just not another spot where villain is really condensed and we're really polar? Yes and no. One issue with overbetting the turn in this spot is simply that villain's range is slightly more uncapped, because he's meant to slow play a king at some frequency on this flop, where he's not meant to slow play a set in the big blind versus under the gun situation out of position. That's actually because the villain's urgency to build the pot is higher when he faces a bet when out of position. And the paired board is just a bit different. The king X combos are not as strong as a set is on an unpaired board and will block some of the continues that they are beating. And so there is a bit of king X available on the right hand board there. And villain's range is slightly more polarized than it would have been otherwise due to that paired flop texture, and therefore we don't use the overbet on the turn. That's just kind of classic GTO, just understanding that paired boards have that effect. Texture is important too, as we'll see soon. Okay, let's talk about merged ranges. You'll hear this term from time to time as well, and it's well worth differentiating what merged means in the context of polar and condensed. Merged ranges are ones which have not been polarized, neither by a player's action nor by the board texture. So the difference really between a merged range and a condensed range is that while merged ranges contain lots of medium strength hands at high concentrations, they may also contain some strong and weak hands as well. Remember, the condensed range had moved away from those. Merged ranges needn't have moved at all. Condensed ranges are merged ranges, but merged ranges aren't always condensed. So a merged range is like a condensed range, only more air heavy and less capped. It maybe hasn't moved towards the middle. It might just still contain middling hands naturally. So when we land on the flop and we've not yet bet, we have a merged range. We have the opportunity to bet to polarize our range, but as of yet we have a merged range. We don't have a condensed range either, because that only happens after we take a more passive action than we could have taken after we check. So polarized ranges again move away from the middle towards the extremities somewhat. Again, in a gradable spectrum-like way where it's not all or nothing. Condensed ranges move in a spectrum-like gradable way towards middling strength hands. and merge ranges maybe haven't moved at all. Cannon rule is a really important rule for understanding how aggressive to be. When you think your opponent's range is merged or condensed, you can fire aggressively, blast away like a cannon for value, and as a bluff. With a polarized strategy, you can deploy a large sizing against merged or condensed ranges. The idea being that your value hands are the ones driving your strategy, and if your opponent's range is merged or condensed, then he has a large amount of more condensed medium strength hands. Medium strength hands don't do well by betting, they invest mainly by calling, so you have to give them the chance to call to make money. Again, your value hands drive your strategy, not your bluffs. Your bluffs are there as fillers in GTO. So as your opponent's range becomes more polar, your investment level as the bettor should start to drop off. As it becomes more condensed, it should increase. That said, you need to think about your own hand as well. It would be completely absurd and ludicrous to sit there and say, oh, he's condensed, so I'm going to overbet my second pair. That would be an absolute butchering of the material. I do hope you're not going to go away from this video and ignore your hand. You still need to have a value hand or a bluff. You need to be adhering to the primary reasons for betting, right? In order to actually overbet the turn or something. We're just saying, if you have a candidate hand, a value bet or a bluff for that practice, then you can be more willing to use a larger sizing and to bet aggressively against a merged range or condensed range than you would against a polarized range. That's the idea. Let's move on and talk about flop texture a little bit now. So the board texture massively affects our relative hand strength. On wetter textures, i.e. textures that are easier to connect with, maybe easier to hit a flush, a straight, a pair, two pair on, trips, just more connectivity. By wetter in this context, I don't actually just mean to do with flushes and straights. I think wet and dry are fairly useless terms and really quite short-sighted terms with limited scope when they merely describe how many flushes or straights are possible, yet this is often how they're used in the community. I think it's better to use wet and dry as ways of actually describing just how generally easy a board is to connect with compared with how easy it is to miss. So an absolute rank of hand, i.e. one pair, which is a really useless label as we said at the start, will be weaker on a wetter texture than it will be on a drier texture. We can split textures into three broad categories. Ones like this are considered fairly dry or semi-dry. The big blind caller's range will be more merged on low boards and more polar on high boards. Have a think about that. Why would it be more merged, meaning containing less of a concentration of polarized hands and more of a concentration of medium hands on a board like 8-7-3, but more polar on Ace-7-3? Well, the idea is that on 8-7-3, the right hand board, the big blind caller will have a lot of mediocre hands, such as a pair on the board. The air in his range will still be okay. It will be like mediocre to bad, but it won't be pitifully bad. It won't be awful. So big blind may have a hand like Jack 10, 10-9, Queen Jack, King Queen, King Jack backdoor, like Ace High. Lots of medium strength hands, showdown value hands, a mix of both, hands with equity, overcards, backdoors, this sort of thing. It's really hard to be dead on 8-7-3 and just have a really, really bad hand. Okay, you might have like Jack 6 of spades. You're still not completely dead, but yeah, okay, that hand is getting there. So there's not that many terrible hands in the big blind caller's range on 8-7-3. Not loads. However, on Ace-7-3, there are a lot of terrible hands, and terrible hands are part of what constitutes a polarized range. So in Ace-7-3, your opponent's actually going to have a hand like Queen Jack of spades, which is now just complete garbage. It's really bad, it's dead. So there's way more terrible hands available on the left-hand board than there is on the right-hand board, and that's going to polarize the range of the left-hand board more, because as we know, terrible hands are one of the key components of a polarized range. On the left-hand board, there also aren't that many mediocre hands. You don't just get two overcards, you don't get ace high anymore, you just get something that's an undercard to the ace, or you get something that's a pair. It's actually quite hard combinatorically speaking to have a pocket pair, and it's also quite hard combinatorically speaking to have a pair on the board on Ace-7-3 that's not an ace, because offsuit combinations of 7x and 3x aren't such a feature in preflop strategies. There are some of them, but they're not that common. So when we think about these two boards, we need to understand that inherently, as soon as the flop comes down, the big blind caller is more merged on 8-7-3, not condensed because they still have sets and some combos are really strong hands. They will be condensed after they don't raise the small c-bet though. And Ace-7-3 will be one where they're more polarized because they have a pair of aces, which is a very good hand. They have lots of two pair, ace-x, making 2 pair here sometimes. And then they have a lot of terrible hands like Jack 10 of clubs as well. On this board, there aren't so many terrible hands. There's a lot more mediocre hands like ace high, 2 overs with a backdoor, a pair, and not even that many really strong hands because there's no way of making top pair. There's no way of leapfrogging all of the kings, queens, jacks, tens, nines, pocket pairs in the button raiser or whoever it is that's raised in their range on the right hand board, but on the left hand board you can soar ahead of all of those hands merely by pairing this ace. Polarized range for big blind, depolarized spot for big blind. Therefore, GTO will recommend if you plug these boards into your solver and give it the choice of, say, a B33 and a B75, meaning 33% and 75% pot respectively, you'll see the solver pick the bigger sizing on the right hand board here because you're against a more merged range than you are on the left hand board where you're against a more polarized range. That's why sizing is what it is in this spot. None of the other reasons you've heard about why sizing is what it is in these spots are correct. You may have heard something like, ace 7-3 is good for your range, so you should bet small. It doesn't make any sense. There's no reason to bet small because something is good for your range. In fact, if something is good for the nutted region of your range, more so than your opponent's, you should bet big. But that's more the case on 8-7-3 where you have a ton of overpairs and he doesn't. Hopefully that makes sense. So on King Jack 5 and 9-7 deuce, these are kind of much wetter textures, and what these are going to do is create a higher abundance of mediocre hands in your opponent's range. So semi-wet textures leave villain's range quite merged or condensed on both high and low flop textures, and therefore we can deploy a large bet sizing with strong hands and bluffs, again polarizing if we're doing that right. Not going to be betting the middle of our range for 75% pot. We're not betting pocket 8, so on King Jack 5 we're not betting ace jack of spades on 9-7 deuce, but we are betting the more polarized hands. And the reason for this, like the reason that the King Jack 5, despite being a higher texture on a semi-wet board, does leave villain's range more merged and condensed and more apt for us to use big bets against it, is that the King Jack 5 creates way more second pair, way more medium strength hands, and also way more flush draws and straight draws, which again are medium equity hands. Flush draws are sometimes referred to as bluffs. They're not, they're mediocre hands. It's very misleading to think of a hand like Queen 10 of clubs or Queen 9 with a diamond or 6-4 of diamonds as a bluff on that left hand semi-wet texture. Those hands are mediocre. When someone has a lot of draws, a lot of gutter straight draws, second pair, weak top pair, they move towards having a more merged range, and therefore we can be more aggressive against their range because we want to focus on getting value from medium strength hands, and the best way to do that is go big. Another way to think about this is, how can you make as many of your opponent's hands indifferent as possible? And the way to do that is to go large on a board like King Jack 5 where villain has 30% equity, 25% equity, a lot. To make that sort of equity indifferent, you have to go big. Queen Jack of spades on the ace 7-3 board has like 12% equity. You can go tiny and it still has to fold, right? So I hope you see the difference here. Now this board, how polarizing is this? Extremely. Wet textures, the big blind is very polar. That's why it's basically exclusively small bets that you'll ever see a solver recommend here. Not just will the solver have a slight solver-like preference for this kind of small sizing, but it will actually now start to claim that a larger bet is squandering EV for a large part of your range and thus costing your range overall EV in a much more major and severe way. So Queen 8-3, the problem is that your opponent, it's not a problem, but the thing we have to observe about the spot is that the big blind caller now has a spade, or 2 spades, or no spades. When they have a spade or 2 spades, they have a very high equity hand that is not indifferent against any sizing, really, apart from like 3x pot. And when they have a hand like the Jack 7 of clubs, they can't even call 10% pot. So you'll even see, if you play around with browser-based solvers or you plug in imaginative sizes into your own custom solver, sometimes you'll see solvers recommend that people actually use a 10% flop c-bet size on some of these boards and some of these spots. You don't have to go that small. There's no EV loss really here, going like 25% pot or 33, but you don't want to be betting like 80% pot on Queen 8-3 all spades. You might have a hand like ace queen of clubs and you might be like, oh my god, I have to deny equity to a spade. You can't. The spade is doing really well against you. No matter what your opponent's hand is, even if it's like 9s with a spade and you have the Queen 10, that 9s with a spade is still fairly live. Okay, if you knew his hand was that, you would maybe go bigger, but you don't. And you don't gain that much by just making a really thin value bet. You're not making your opponent fold a good spade or pair plus spade here anyway, and he doesn't have 2 low cards like 4 or 5 off with the 5 of spades. That doesn't exist. So you don't make your opponent fold a spade hand, even if you go bigger here, and all you're really doing is value betting really thinly and destroying your EV when you run into a flush. So go small on this right hand texture, please go small. Alright, on to turn and river texture now. So a turn or river texture is basically just a combination of all 4 or all 5 board cards. Don't focus really heavily or solely on the card that just came out. Yes, it's good to think about what that's done to ranges and recalibrate your assessment of how favourable a world you're in, your standards for bluffing, your relative hand strength, that sort of thing, whether you can value bet and for what sizing. This is all key, but don't obsess about just the card that came out. Don't fall into the trap of saying the 4 changed nothing. No, the spot is changed. You're now in a turn barrel spot, not a flop. C-bet spot. Your opponent called the flop. That changed lots of things. And the 4, in being a card that wasn't a queen or a flush card or whatever, has changed something. It's one of the unique turns in the deck. Of course, it's had an effect, right? The nothing changed fallacy is one to be avoided. So here, we c-bet the flop, we overbet the turn because we have a clean run out. We have a classic instance of a spot where under the gun's range is totally uncapped and big blind's range is much more capped. Note that if under the gun had bet big on this flop, that would be a slight error because this is a board that's quite polarizing for the big blind's range. But had under the gun bet big here, big blind could have slow played a set of 10s or ace-3 at a much higher frequency and would be less capped on this turn. It would still probably be okay for under the gun to overbet in that situation, but it's the fact that under the gun is bet small on this flop that makes it very good to overbet this turn because big blind's range is really capped here. What you're doing when you bet small on this flop and then overbet the turn is effectively funneling your opponent's range into being mostly condensed and medium, and then maximizing value against that range by betting very large. There's nothing wrong with your opponent being capped here. Your opponent's not done anything bad to be capped here. We shouldn't be sitting in this spot thinking, oh, he's made an error because he's capped. It's okay to be capped in a lot of situations. It's just in this one, we need to be aware of it and adjust our sizing accordingly. So what is the value betting threshold here for our hand? What is one of the weakest hands that we can value bet? Pause the video, have a think about it. What would you say? Well, it's actually ace-king, because ace-queen is not value bettable on this river. You might be thinking, that's so nitty. Why can I not bet ace-queen on this river? The idea is that when you actually filter by overbetting the turn, you cause a strong condensing effect in villain's range, but so much so that loads of medium strength hands now get folded out. If you then go ahead and bet the river having overbet the turn, what happens is that your opponent is only incentivized to call top pair sometimes and will fold a ton of top pair and then will call with 2 pair like pretty much every time. So if you value bet ace queen on this river, you come very close to having not enough equity when called to make that better than checking, because of course, like if you check, you end the action, right? By betting here, you're going to get raised sometimes, you're going to bet fold sometimes, and that's going to cost you money as well. So you need ace-king here to value bet this river because you've overbet turn, because that has decreased the relative hand strength of your hand on the river. That's not a bad thing. We're not striving to avoid a situation where we have to check back ace-queen on the river. We've already got our value for this hand, that's totally fine. But what we need to do here, what we need to be cognizant of, is how much filtering we've caused in our opponent's range and what that's done to our relative hand strength. This texture is very clean, but even so, the value betting threshold is quite high up, but it's 1 pair. You can value bet ace-king here because the texture is clean. On a more disgusting run out for your range, you wouldn't be able to do that, right? If the river had come a jack here, there'd be no value betting with ace-king. On a messy run out like this one, where it becomes 3 straight in a different way again on the river and 3 flush on the river, you're going to have a much, much higher value betting threshold. Pause the video. What do you think is the weakest hand that under the gun can value bet this river with? Same action sequence apart from the turn sizing being a bit smaller. The reason the turn sizing is smaller here is that the jack is partially uncapping to your opponent's range, and they will be slightly repolarized by that card when they call flop and then face a turn bet. They will be more polar than they would be on a brick because they will gain some nutted hands like king queen or 2 pair that they wouldn't have had on a brick turn. So this is just something for us to be aware of. So now our value betting threshold is actually all the way down at something like a straight, even top set here can't value bet. I think if you had second set, it might even be slightly more reasonable on blocking the top card, but effectively here you're looking at having a straight or better to value bet this river. This seems insanely nitty, perhaps, but you need to be in reasonable shape having bet the 3rd time and being called. Your opponent has just made lots of flushes And it's very important to note that the ace on the flop here is not a club, facilitating a lot of top pair plus club reaching this river. That would not be the case if the ace was the club and the 3 was a diamond or something like that on the flop, and the 10 was a spade, and just mix the suits around so that he can't have ace-x of clubs now because it's blocked by the board. And what we'd see in that situation is that villain would have way less flushes and we could value bet more thinly. Okay, let's talk about urgency on the turn. So urgency again is basically how quickly our hand craves putting money into the pot immediately and how much money it wants to invest now. Our good hands on the flop are going to lose their urgency to double barrel the turn for value when the card is messy or even something we could call a disastrous turn. Have a think about what those might be. What's a disaster turn for a flop c-better's range? So a clean turn like this one is going to mean the urgency is still really high. We want to put loads of money in. We don't expect our opponent to be piling tons of money into the pot on the river or anything like that. So slow playing here doesn't really make much sense. Checking behind with a set on this turn is a procedural blunder. It's a very egregious thing to do because you'd essentially be relying on your opponent to start aggressing wildly on the next street to make up for all that lost ground from not building the pot yourself. You would need villain to be really going crazy on the river if you checked back this turn is under the gun, and that's just not happening because, as we know, big blind's condensed range is not going to be incentivized to do loads of aggressing on the next street. It's really important that we bet our good hands here. Urgency is high, and even a hand like ace king, according to the solver, has to bet now. This purple color is an overbet. Again, this should be a familiar pattern by now, that on a card that leaves your opponent's range as condensed as it became when he called flop, maybe more so considering that this card could have been a 10 or a queen. This means that we need to value bet aggressively and just keep going. We need to be the ones that build the pot, not villain. We cannot rely on a condensed range to give us lots of money. It's not about whether your opponent's folding or how often they're folding. If they fold, they fold. That's not within your control. It's just about making money from the shape of their range in a way that's correct based on that range shape. And against condensed ranges, we need to be the aggressor when we have a value hand. On a disaster turn, like a 10, this is what I was hinting at earlier, a card that absolutely smashes the range that big blind has called this flop with. It's not that we can't have a 10, or we don't have a 10 and he does. We do have a 10, because we're going to bet this flop a lot, and we're going to bet middle pair, second pair, third pair, top pair, all kinds of hands here. If we're betting all of our range on the flop, then we'll have all of our 10x. The problem is we haven't filtered towards the 10x. We haven't concentrated ourselves around having 10x, but he has. So when big blind calls the flop, remember that they condense their range. They shed a bunch of their really good and really bad combos. What does that leave their range more centered towards? That's right, a 10, a mediocre hand. This is why we have to be so incredibly careful in these kind of situations. Now ace king, a hand that was a pure overbet effectively on the left hand situation on the blank turn, the 6 of hearts, is now a mix of b75 and check. You can value bet this hand, you don't want to very often, because globally speaking your range doesn't want to bet very often in the first place, but you just want to check back here a lot. You're closing the action, your opponent has just gained a ton of nuts, repolarized by the turn card, they'll be raising you a ton here. If you're not careful, if you build a range that's betting too often, you'll get raised absolutely chaotically. Like the player will just absolutely attack you if they know that's what you're doing. So yeah, we need to have a really reined in turn betting strategy here. We need to be extremely careful about what hands we're betting and how often. And even a hand as powerful as ace king is a very frequent check here if we want to protect that checking range. And we do want to slow play here now as well, because what's going to happen on the river is that because villain has a lot of trips now that can overbet, when we check back, he should be overbet bluffing the river. So the amount of money that we can now earn with the ace king by slow playing our hand and checking behind is now catapulted upwards because our opponent is now so incentivized to fast play and just go for extreme value on the river with something like trips. Now that's bad, we lose to that hand, but the upside is that they will also be bluffing the river and we will win with ace king. We will bluff catch river with a hand like ace king pretty frequently and win money from bluffs. So it's okay to check back here and lose out on 3 streets from ace 4, ace 5, ace 7. You don't want to get blinded by those hands and only tunnel vision target them like we saw in lecture 1. Rather, what you want to do is think about the entire game tree and imagine all of the different sources of EV here that you can get. Importantly, note how the sizing of choice is not just the investment frequency, but also the sizing of choice is dropping as villain's range becomes more polar compared to when it's very condensed on the left-hand side. Very key example, make sure you understand this one. Configuration is the range versus range matchup that occurs based on the pre-flop positions and action sequence of the parties who go post-flop. So in tighter configurations, such as under the gun against cutoff 3-bet pot, or under the gun against button 4-bet pot, or under the gun against big blind single raise pot, relative hand strength is not going to be as high for absolute hand strength as it would be in late position, like button versus big blind, blind versus blind. In other words, relative hand strength will be below absolute hand strength in tighter configurations and above it in looser configurations, because as ranges get wider, you don't need as good a hand to have a relatively powerful holding. So let's take an example of a spot. So in a tight configuration, under the gun against big blind, what we're seeing here is that when under the gun bets all of their range, remember that's what R33 means, big blind is folding 40%. What would be the break-even fold equity there for under the gun? In other words, if this was a neutral world, range versus range, how often would big blind fold if they were actually incentivized to meet the minimum defense frequency in that spot? That's right, it would be 25%. So folding 40% is basically an admission that your range is getting destroyed. And that's fine. Remember, big blind is not supposed to try to defend 75% of the time, just to arbitrarily and foolishly satisfy some mathematical thing that assumes that ranges are equal. MDF, minimum defense frequency, is only a guideline, and we need to violate it whenever ranges are unequal and whenever we think that more or less hands are profitable to defend than would be on average in an average equal configuration. So under the gun against big blind is really suffering, getting away from the pot here 40% of the time. Under the gun is clearly in a very profitable situation, but so they should be, because they have a lot more strong hand density in their range, especially on a board with 2 high cards such as this one. It's because under the gun doesn't have a lot of air in this spot that the air that under the gun does have becomes so profitable due to all of this fold equity. That's what's supposed to happen. It's almost like if you're lucky enough to have nothing, that doesn't really work, right? Because you'd rather have something. But if you're lucky enough to be under the gun when you have King 7 of spades here, enjoy it, bet and get loads of folds. It's a great spot for your range. It doesn't matter that your hand is bad. Range trumps hand in this configuration, to some extent. So when you're in a looser configuration, for example, button versus big blind, single raise pot, 2-bet pot, and you range bet, which is again fine, what's going to happen here is that you're going to get folds from the big blind way less frequently. It's still completely auto-profitable to c-bet every hand. That doesn't mean that you should, although you actually should because your range is doing so well. But remember, we're not just satisfied with doing something plus EV, we want to do the highest EV thing. But in this spot, it will be really high EV to bet any hand in your range, and there'll be certain hands that you have to bet, and betting all of your range will not incur any EV loss as a simplified strategy. Even if a solver is betting 80% instead of 100, you can bet 100% here even on the button, but don't expect to get 40% fold equity unless your opponent is far too tight. Now your fold equity drops down to just around 30%, which is still great, but it's not as strong a filtering effect as you will see when you're under the gun against big blind. So this just shows you that the pre-flop positions really matter. And one of the more widespread, I guess, leaks that I see in students' games sometimes is that they forget about pre-flop. They literally forget about whether they're against hijack or whether they're against button. And this isn't just bad exploitatively, because we know from exploitative data that actually position has a huge effect on how much people are bluffing. Pre-flop position has a massive effect on bluff to value ratios later on in a hand. But we also just need to fold more theoretically speaking as well. And this is a theoretical course, as you guys probably know since you've bought it. Hopefully you've bought it. But yeah, it's very much the case that you need to pay attention to that, because it's a 10% difference here. There will be hands like pocket fives that are mandatory calls when you're against button here that are just folds against under the gun. So hugely different. Configuration and bluffing now. So it's also a great idea to familiarize yourself with call fold thresholds and how they shift when a configuration gets tighter or looser. So for example, if you are in this spot where you're facing the range bet here, you will not want to defend these hands pure. But over in this spot where you're against the button, you will want to defend most of these hands pure. But why is this? Is this something to do with how often your opponent is bluffing? Not really, because they're meant to have a certain bluff to value ratio anyway in most spots, but when they're betting range, you just run into a so-called bluff or a low equity hand or air hand way less frequently. There just aren't as many to go around. So think about it this way. When under the gun is on queen 10-3, he's just bluffing less often because there aren't as many bluffs to grab onto and bet with as there are when he's button. So both of these players are betting their whole range. They're not going out of their way to build a different bluff to value ratio or anything like that. They just naturally have more air hands on the button and less hands under the gun. So if you're not careful, you will end up in some other boards where you can't range bet. You can end up really over bluffing if you just bet all of your range from a late position, whereas from an early position it may or may not be as bad depending on the texture. But this is interesting, right? Big blind's defense is very different on the left hand board here than it is on the right. Ace 9 is just a break even call on the left. The EV there is 0.16% pot. That's absolutely nothing. It's basically break even. Yes, the solver is folding, but you can see it wouldn't be too bad to defend. On the right though, it's calling all the time because this is profitable. This is now a profitable call. Sevens would be a really bad fold on the right hand spot against button, but it's like a perfectly fine fold against under the gun. One question though, why does the viability of calling the first two hands change but not the third? Why does the 9-8 still become a mix? What you see in the right hand side, by the way, is a frequency display where you can see how often it's calling and how often it's folding. On the left you can see EV, but the EV won't be changing on the right. Whenever a solver is mixing call with fold, it's because those two lines have the same EV. No one is better than the other. So why is this happening? Why do we observe this phenomenon with 9-8? Well, the idea is that 9-8 is a non-made hand. It doesn't beat anything in the under the gun player's range anyway, really without improving. It's always a hand that's going to need to either bluff or improve to win the pot. So it doesn't really matter for 9-8 how many combos of ace 6 are in your opponent's range, because 9-8 loses to ace 6. What does matter for pocket 7s and for ace 9 though is how many combos of ace high, king high, jack high, etc. exist, because those hands actually beat those combos and are doing well. So 9-8 is a hand that is kind of insensitive to how strong your opponent's range is, because it's just always going to be a hand that needs to improve or bluff to win anyway. Thus it's going to have similar calling EV. So if there's a main type of hand that gets worse as we move from a looser configuration to a tighter one, it's almost exclusively going to be like a made hand with some fairly mediocre strength. Let's do a quiz on this now. I want you guys to look at 4 situations where you're facing a bet and to try to work out whether these are calls or not, depending on your relative hand strength. I want you to ignore the option of raising for now. So have a look at these 4 questions, take your time, write down some answers, have a look at the action sequence, and we're about to do this exercise followed by the official homework for this week after this. So you might want to set aside a bit of time to do this, maybe half an hour to 45 minutes for both, but we'll start with this one, then we're going to move on to more practice on bluffing. I'll assume that you've attempted questions 1 through 4 here in the relative hand strength quiz, and I'll go over the answers now. So question 1, we have queen 8, a hand that starts off looking quite good on the flop, but what happens here is that the turn comes down disastrously for our range. Note that this jack turn is really good for under the gun, mainly because they have 16 combinations of ace king and we don't have any. Unless we slow play this pre, sometimes maybe it's not so bad against under the gun, but usually we're going to 3-bet that hand, right? So we don't really have any combos of the nut straight, we don't really have many combos of sets, and we don't even have as dense an amount of 2-pair as the under the gun player does in this spot. So we're not doing well at all in this card, but what we really need to do is still meet some kind of reasonable defense frequency. The problem is that it doesn't really matter whether we have a hand like queen 8 or whether we have a hand like 10-8 here. They're effectively a very similar hand, so what we'd rather focus on is having redraw to go with a pair, to go with a bluff catcher, and not just have the top pair. It's much better here to have a hand like jack 9, 10-9, king 10, king jack, than it is to have queen 8. So lo and behold, this hand is actually being folded by the solver, but I would like to point out that if you call this hand, it's not a massive EV mistake or anything. You're only losing 0.37% pot, it's absolutely nothing, but this hand is technically meant to be a fold now. We don't have a lot of this hand just due to the fact that the solver was 3-betting pre-flop as a bluff with this specific combo in this specific sim or whatever, but when we do have this hand, we fold a turn. Hand 2 is going to be a call. This one is notably better. We're against button, better configuration for us, and we're facing a bet from a much wider range. We also have a bluff catcher with a nut straight draw. When you combine a pair plus a draw like this, you typically want to continue, and again you'll probably find that ace 10 here is a better call than something like queen 4 suited. Hand 3, King Jack, is actually borderline. You might think we just don't have the odds here and this is just a plain fold. We'll see more about this in a couple of lectures' time, that actually don't have the odds as a fallacy because you have implied odds and some showdown value with this hand too. That's right, you can actually win against the Jack 9 that gives up the river at some frequency. Villain can't just pure barrel every hand worse than King Jack on the river, lest he'll be over bluffing. So this hand can call for a mix of implied odds, showdown value, pair draw, and straight draw. We basically have exactly the pot entitlement, the 30% of the pot that we need here, no more, no less. Not because we have 30% equity, but because we make up the deficit in implied odds. And pocket 8s, this one is closer than you would think as well. It's very easy to overfold your range too much in this kind of spot. This one is, again, a marginal call. You can make it. You can't really make a mistake with this hand in a vacuum, but if you always fold this hand, you will be overfolding your range, which is not advisable unless you have a read. Just opens you up to exploitation for no purpose. So this hand is a call mainly because the 8s are actually fairly high cards compared with like 5s or 4s. The problem with having like a 5 or a 4 as your pair here, like pair of 5s, pair of 4s, is that your opponent always has 2 overcards to go with whatever draw they have. So if your opponent has a hand like 8, 9 of clubs, right, which is a really big hand, well, they can't have that when you have 8s with a club. But let's say they have something like just 8, 9, some other combo of 8, 9. They can hit a jack and they can win, they can hit a 9 and they can win, but they can't hit an 8. But if you had pocket 5s or pocket 4s here, they could draw to both the overcards and the straight draw. Your hand is essentially much more frail, even against villains' bluffing range when you have a very low pair. So favor calling something like 8s over something like 5s here. Okay, on to homework task 4. I will go over the answers again after you've had a chance to do the homework, then we'll wrap up for today. So again, give yourself 15-20 minutes. I don't know, maybe you don't need that long. Think about these spots. Try not to solve them. Try not to look up the answers. Try to do this on your own. You'll get more out of it. And yeah, pause the video now. I'll assume you've done that. Let's go over the answers. So the idea of this homework is to assign the label can bluff, cannot bluff, or must bluff to each of these hands. This is basically building on what we did last time. The reason that this is not about the topic of today is that we just did an exercise on relative hand strength, and what I'd really like to talk about here is bluffing again, because this is such a key concept, and I want the Carrot Poker School to be a very methodical process where you go back and revise. I want you guys to get into the habit of going back and looking at tasks that you've done previously. So on that note, question 1, is this hand bluffable? It's certainly not a must bluff, but the answer is yes, you can bluff in hand 1. Most turn barrel situations are relatively favourable worlds for your range. In those relatively favourable situations, you can usually drop your standards. You can have higher EV bluffs, but you also need lower EV bluffs at some frequency. You don't just want to fall into the trap of the comfort blanket fallacy that we looked at last time, where you only have flush draws and straight draws when you're bluffing here. You also want to have some low EV hands like Queen 6 of spades. Note that spades are not a bad suit to have here blocker-wise. You'd rather have spades than hearts or clubs. You'd prefer to have a diamond to unblock the folding range and block the continues, but you don't actually mind having spades because they will unblock the backdoor hearts and clubs that can fold the turn. So this is an absolutely okay bluff. I would make it sometimes. Hand 2, the 10-9 here is a no-no. You cannot lead this hand. Why not? Because you're now the big blind, your range is now at a big disadvantage. Remember that button retains their range advantage by checking back the flop. The only thing they lose is the nut advantage. That's a very different thing, guys. They retain the range advantage, and therefore the 10-9 is going to be below the threshold of selectivity that we need here. We need to be a bit more strict about what we're bluffing in a world such as this that's so unfavourable. Question 3, this one is really interesting. We check call the flop, check on the turn, then we land on the river. Note that we've strengthened our range really massively by calling flop. We've shed all of our worst hands. Villain, meanwhile, has taken a really weak line. Betting and then checking in that order is typically much, much weaker than even checking and then betting. Betting and then checking polarizes and then weakens and caps your opponent's range. That leaves them with a massive density of air. You don't have a ton of showdown value here with King High at all. Betting is going to yield way more fold equity than the break-even point. You're not going to win super often by checking, so this is a mandatory bluff. And finally, question 4, we are in the big blind here with the King Queen of Diamonds. check, 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 all the way to the river. The problem with bluffing here is that you just have way too much showdown value. On a board that has 3 jacks, you basically have 3 cards that are near impossible to hit, especially in an action sequence of check, 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 check. Like, it's just completely very, very difficult to hit this jack. The 9 and the 5 are also not cards that exist at massive frequencies pre-flop, so basically this board is extremely dry and difficult to connect with. What that means is that ace high is a very strong hand here that's winning really often, and king high is like a mediocre to bad hand, but not a bad enough one that you should start bluffing with it. So no king high here should ever be a bet for small blind. Small blind can be bluffing lower down than that. This hand is a mandatory check. Alright guys, I hope that you've enjoyed this lecture. It's been a pretty dense one, so definitely go back, revise, look at the examples again, and I'll see you guys for lecture 5 whenever you want to watch that. Do pace these out, do revise, do go back and look at what you've done. I think it's the best way to go through the course. Alright, I'll see you next time.